in nomine Christos Redemptoris apou pantos cacadimonos. In nomine Mashiach Redemptoris apou pantos cacademonos. Structure and Functions of the Body, a handbook of anatomy and physiology for nurses and others desiring a practical knowledge of the subject. By Annette Fisk, A.M., graduate of the Waltham Training School for Nurses. Illustrated, Philadelphia and London, W.B. Saunders Company, 1911. Copyright 1911 by W.B. Saunders Company, printed in America. Ebook prepared by Project Gutenberg. Read by Christopher Robert Neal, Doctor of Jurisprudence. Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4, Contents. The organs of special sense. The nose, the sense of smell, the mouth, the hyoid bone, the teeth, the sense of taste, salivary glands, the tonsils, the ear, Eustachian tubes, sensation of hearing, the eye, Lacrimal Gland, coats of the eye, light rays and sight. Accommodation, color perception. Chapter 5, the nervous system, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, pons varioli, medulla oblongata, spinal cord, brain centers, motor tract, sensory tract, reflex action, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, Brachio Plexus, Sacral Plexus, the sympathetic system, the sympathetic nerves. Chapter 4, the organs of special sense. The nose. The nose, the organ of the sense of smell, is composed of a framework of bones and cartilages, the bridge being formed by the two nasal bones, and the septum by the vomer and the triangular cartilage. It consists of two parts, the external nose and the internal or nasal fossae, which open to the face by the anterior nares or nostrils and into the pharynx by the posterior nares. Externally, it is covered with skin, internally with ciliated mucous membrane. The fossae have the inferior turbinated bones along their outer walls and are divided into three parts known as the superior, the middle, and the inferior meatus. The middle one connecting with the antrum of Highmore, while into the inferior meatus the lacrimal canal empties. There are many small muscles of which little use is made, although in forced respiration, as in pneumonia, where every aid to breathing is called into play. Even the alle nasi, or nostrils, are made to exert what muscular power they possess in order to supply more air. Not only is most of the air breathed in through the nose and warmed in its passage through, but the nose is the organ of smell, and by means of the peculiar property of its nerves, protects the lungs against deleterious gases, and helps the taste discriminate. The olfactory, or first cranial nerves, after emerging from the brain, lie on the undersurface of the frontal lobe and rest on the ethmoid bone in what is known as the olfactory tract. Each nerve ends in a bulb-like termination called an olfactory bulb, which rests on the cribriform plate and sends little terminal fibers down through to be distributed to the nasal cavities, especially to the upper half of the septum of the nose, the roof of the nose, and the anterior and middle turbinated bones. For in the mucous membrane of the for in the mucous membrane of the upper nasal cavity are specifically modified epithelial cells called olfactory cells, which play an important part in the conduction of smell. Hence, when one wishes to smell anything, especially well, he sniffs it up. Probably the sensation of smell is caused by odoriferous particles in the atmosphere being breathed into the nose, where they affect the olfactory cells, which transmit the impulses to the olfactory nerve and so to the brain. Whereas a certain amount of moisture in the nasal cavity seems to be essential for accuracy of smell, the presence of too much or too little interferes with it. The mucous membrane has a certain power also of distinguishing different smells at the same time, though this power varies greatly in different people, one smell often wholly overpowering all others. The cartilage below the bridge of the nose is sometimes attacked in syphilis and cancer, and lupus often begins on the nose. Deviation of the septum may occlude all air from one side of the nose, an effect also produced by polypi, generally of the turbinated bone. Either condition is easily remedied. Nosebleed, though generally unimportant, may be serious in adults. The mouth. The mouth is of great importance as an entrance for fresh air to the lungs when the nasal passages are for any reason impeded, and as the resonant chamber from which proceeds the voice, man's chief means of communication with his fellows. Its chief value may be said, however, to reside in the fact that it is the vestibule of the alimentary canal. It is an ovoid cavity lined with mucous membrane and is bound in front by the lips, at the sides of the cheeks, below by the floor and tongue, and above by the hard palate anteriorly, and by the soft palate posteriorly. The uvula, depending from the latter, like a curtain between the mouth and the pharynx. Shape is given to the mouth by the bones of the upper and lower jaw, and its size is altered by the lowering and raising of the latter, which is quite freely movable. At the back of the mouth, at the entrance to the pharynx, are the anterior and posterior pillars of the fauces, which contain muscular tissue, and between which on either side are thick masses of lymphoid tissue, the tonsils. The floor of the mouth is formed largely by the tongue, which completely fills the space within the lower teeth. Its base or root is directed backward and downward and is attached by muscles to the hyoid bone and the lower jaw. The hyoid bone being a horseshoe-shaped bone lying just below and as it were within the interior maxillary. The base of the tongue is attached also to the epiglottis and at the sides of the soft palate by the anterior pillars. Except at its base and the posterior part of its under surface, the tongue is free. But a fold of mucous membrane, the frenum, holds it somewhat in front. Thus it possesses great versatility of motion and serves as an auxiliary in articulation, mastication, and deglutition, or deglutition, the teeth. Securely embedded in either jaw are the teeth, nature's instrument for the first preparation of the food for digestion through tearing and grinding. The incisors, which are in front, have wide, sharp edges for cutting food. Next come the canine teeth with a sharp point for tearing it, while at the back are the molars with a broad, flat top for grinding. There are two sets of teeth. The temporary or milk teeth, 20 in number, 4 incisors, 2 canines, and 4 molars in each jaw, which appear at from 6 months to 2 years. And 2. The permanent teeth, 32 in number, 4 incisors, 2 canines, known as eye teeth in the upper jaw, and as stomach teeth in the lower jaw, 4 bicuspids, so called because they have 2 cusps where the molars have 4 or 5, and 6 molars in each jaw, which come from the 6th to the 21st years. The first to appear are the 2 lower middle incisors, which come at the age of 6 months. The last to appear are the wisdom teeth, the farthest back of the molars, which come at the age of 21 years or thereabouts. Each tooth consists of a crown or body above the gum, a neck, and a fang or root within the gum. The body is of dentine or ivory with a thin crust of enamel and contains the pulp, a vascular connective tissue containing many nerves. Beginning at the neck and covering the fang is a layer of cement or chew bone. The sense of taste. The sense of taste lies chiefly in the taste buds, as they are called, which are filled with gustatory cells, and are found in the papillae of the tongue, principally in the circumvallate papillae at the back of the tongue, which are few in number and arranged in a V shape. There is also a certain power of taste in the tip and sides of the tongue, but little in the upper surface or dorsum. Only 5 special tastes can be distinguished: bitter, sweet, acid, sour, and salt. But sometimes more than one can be distinguished at a time, as bitter and sweet. Everyone can distinguish between different tastes, but the power varies in different people and with different conditions. Certain tastes seem to be better distinguished in certain places, as sweet at the tip and bitter at the back of the tongue. Moreover, the sense of taste is very dependent upon the sense of smell, especially in the case of aromatic and savory substances, which one really does not taste but smell. If one held his nose and closed his eyes, he would not know from the taste whether he was eating onion or apple. This leads to the habit of pinching the nose when taking nauseous medicines. To be tasted, a substance must be in solution. Friction against the tongue, lips, or cheek increase the sense of taste. A temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit favors taste, while both great heat and great cold impair it. There are probably at least two nerves of taste: the lingual branch of the trifacial or fifth cranial, and the gustatory branch of the glossopharyngeal. Along with the sense of taste, there are other senses in the mouth which play an important part, such as pressure and the sense of heat and cold, and it is often hard to distinguish them from the pure sensation of taste, which indeed is always accompanied by them. Salivary glands. On either side of the mouth are three racemose glands for the secretion of the saliva, which serves to soften and lubricate the food and partially to digest starches by means of its ferment, ptyalin. The parotid gland is the largest and is below and in front of the ear, opening by Stinson's duct. The supramaxillary gland is below the jaw toward the back on either side, and its duct is Wharton's duct. The sublingual gland lies beneath the mucous membrane of the floor of the mouth and opens by 8 to 20 tiny ducts beside the frenum, the ducts of Ravenous. The activity of the glands depends upon the blood supply. The more blood, the greater their activity. The tonsils. The tonsils vary in size and in tonsillitis swell and may even meet in the meridian line. The tonsils vary in size and in tonsillitis swell and may even meet in the median line. They are frequently removed. When they are enlarged, one often gets a third tonsil or adenoids, a lymphoid growth at the back of the pharynx which causes mouth breathing by day and snoring by night. A child with adenoids is starved for air, and what air is breathed in is not warmed. The growth should be removed. A short frenum produces tongue tie, which may be remedied by snipping. Cancer of the tongue is fairly common and necessitates a radio operation. In mumps, the parotid glands are inflamed and enlarged. The ear. The special organ of hearing is the ear, to which there are three parts: the external, the middle, and the internal ear. The external ear consists of the pinna or expanded cartilaginous portion for the concentration and direction of sound waves, and the external auditory canal, and the external auditory canal, partly cartilage, partly bone, which is directed forward, inward, and downward, and conveys sound to the middle ear. The middle ear, or tympanum is an irregular cavity in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Its outer wall is formed by the membrana tympani or drum, an oval translucent membrane placed obliquely at the bottom of the external auditory canal. The middle ear communicates with the inner ear through the fenestra ovalis or oval window and contains the ossicles. The malleoles are hammer, the incus are anvil, and the steps or stirrup, which are arranged in a movable chain from the drum to the oval window. The malleus, which is connected with the membrana tympani, articulates by its head with the body of the incus, while the steps articulates with the incus by its head and is connected by its base with the margin of the oval window. Connection is made between the middle ear and the pharynx, and the pressure of the air upon the drum made equal on either side by means of the Eustachian tubes. These tubes are about an inch and a half long, have cilia, and convey wax and other matter from the ear to the pharynx. Occasionally, in a cold or for some other reason, they become stopped up and trouble results in the middle ear. Some of the mastoid cells also connect with the middle ear and may become infected, causing mastoid disease. The internal ear consists of various chambers hollowed out in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. There is an osseous labyrinth consisting of a central cavity known as the vestibule, three semicircular canals, and the cochlea, and within the osseous labyrinth, surrounded by perilymph, is the membranous labyrinth or like form filled with the endolymph. Communication exists externally with the middle ear by the round and oval windows, and internally with the internal auditory canal, through which passes the eighth cranial or auditory nerve, the special nerve of hearing, which is distributed to the inner ear only. When the auditory nerve enters the ear through this internal auditory meatus, it divides into two branches, of which one goes to the vestibule and the other to the organ of Corti, a group of specially modified epithelial cells in the cochlea of the membranous labyrinth, which is very important in transmitting the impulses to the brain. The nerve also breaks up into very small branches and is distributed practically throughout the wall of the labyrinth. The sensation of hearing is the result of impulses transmitted to the auditory nerve and so conveyed to the auditory center in the brain. It is caused by sound waves which travel through the air from their point of origin and enter the external ear. This collects and selects the waves of sound and helps one to a certain extent to determine the direction from which the sound comes. As they pass through the external meatus, the sound waves are collected into a comparatively small area for transmission to the middle ear, where by means of the drum they set in vibration the chain of ossicles. Through these, the vibrations are in turn transmitted to the oval window, being intensified in the process. Here again they are taken up by the perilymph, from which they pass through the wall of the membranous labyrinth to the endolymph, affecting the epithelial lining of the labyrinth in such a way that the impulses are transmitted to the auditory nerve, more particularly in the vestibule, from which the vibrations enter the cochlea or cochlea. They also affect the cells of the organ of Corti in like manner as they pass from the perilymph to the endolymph. The membrane that covers the fenestra rotunda or round window relaxes and extends as the vibrations strike it, thus serving to eliminate the shock of impact. Musical sounds are caused by rhythmical or regularly repeated vibrations, while irregular vibrations give rise to noises. In musical sounds, loudness is determined by the height or amplitude of the vibrations, pitch by the length of the wave, and quality by the number of so-called partial tones. A sensation of sound cannot be produced by less than 30 vibrations. A sensation of sound cannot be produced by less than 30 vibrations a second, and the ordinary person cannot hear more than 16,000 vibrations a second. Different sounds can be distinguished when they follow each other as closely as by 1/100th of a second. All sound does not come through the canal of the ear. The bones of the head vibrate and carry sound. So there are instruments for the deaf which are put in the ear and others which are placed between the teeth. The semicircular canals are not essential to hearing, but have something to do with a person's power of maintaining his equilibrium. Injury to them may cause dizziness and loss of equilibrium. The eye. One more feature, perhaps the most expressive, remains to be described: the eye. The senses are all modifications of the original cutaneous sensibility, and the nerve of sight is no more sensitive to light than any other nerve. It therefore needs an end organ that is sensitive to the motions of the ether in order to give impressions of light. This organ is provided in the eye, which is not only itself capable of being moved in every direction, but is placed in the most movable part of the body, the head, which can be turned in almost a complete circle. The eyeball is spherical and lies in the cavity of the orbit upon a cushion of fat, where it has a large range of sight, but is securely protected from injury by its bony surroundings. The sunken eyes following protracted illness are due to the using by the system of the fat on which the eyeball ordinarily rests. Each orbital cavity is formed by the junction of some 7 bones and communicates with the cavity of the brain through the optic foramen and through the sphenoidal fissure. Above the orbits are arched eminences of skin, the eyebrows, from which several rows of short hairs grow longitudinally and which serve to protect the eyes. and to limit the amount of light to a certain extent, as in frowning. Still further, protection is afforded by the eyelids, longitudinal folds of skin, the one above the other below. Still further protection is afforded by the eyelids, longitudinal folds of skin, the one above, the other below, which close like curtains over the eye. Beneath the external layer of skin in the lids is fatty tissue, and then the orbicularis palpebrarum muscle by means of which they are closed. They are kept in shape by the tarsal plates or cartilages, in whose ocular surface are embedded the meibomian glands, whose secretion prevents the free edges of the lids from sticking together. Along these edges grows a double or triple row of stiff hairs, the eyelashes, which curve outward so as not to interfere with each other, and also to prevent the entrance into the eye of foreign bodies, lining the inner surface of the lids and reflected thence over the anterior surface of the sclerotic coat of the eye is a mucous membrane, the conjunctiva, which is thick, opaque, and vascular on the lids, but thin and transparent on the eyeball. The angles between the lids are known as the internal and the external canthals. Muscles and nerves. The eyeball is held in position by the ocular muscles, the conjunctiva, and the lids, while surrounding it, yet allowing free movement, is a thin membranous sac, the tunica vaginalis oculi. The superior and inferior recti muscles at the upper and lower edges of the ball turn the eye up and down. The internal and external recti at the inner and outer edges turn the eye inward and outward, and the superior and inferior oblique rotate the eye. The nerves supplying these muscles are the third or motor oculi, the fourth and the sixth. The lacrimal gland, which is about the size and shape of an almond, is situated at the upper and outer parts of the orbit. It secretes a fluid which keeps the anterior surface of the eye bathed in moisture and is ordinarily drained away through the lacrimal sac in the inner canthals, whence it passes by the lacrimal ducts into the nose. When the amount secreted is excessive, it overflows the lower lid as tears. Coats of eye. The membranes or coats of the eye are three in number: an outer or sclerotic, a middle or vascular, and an inner or sensitive. The sclerotic coat is a rather thick, fibrous protective membrane where it passes in front of the iris. However, it is thinner and transparent and is known as the cornea. The cornea projects somewhat and, as it were, resembles a segment of a smaller sphere set into the rest of the sclerotic. The middle or vascular coat, known as the choroid, carries blood vessels for the retina or sensitive coat in its inner layer and has an outer layer of pigment cells that excludes light and darkens the inner chamber of the eye. The folds of the choroid at its anterior margin contains the ciliary muscles and are known as the ciliary processes, while the name iris is given to the little round pigmented, perforated, curtain-like muscle just in front of the crystalline lenses. The posterior surface of the iris is covered with a thick layer of pigment cells to prevent the entrance of light through the central opening or pupil. And its anterior surface also has pigment cells that give it its color, though the difference in the color of people's eyes is due rather to the amount of pigment present than to its color. A small amount of pigment being present in blue eyes and a large amount in brown and black eyes. Variation in the size of the pupil are brought about by contractions of the circular and radiating fibers of the iris, contraction of the circular fibers making it smaller and those of the radiating larger. The pupil is constricted for near objects and during sleep, and is dilated for distant objects. In a dull light, also it dilates to let in more light, and in a bright light it contracts. The appearance of the pupil is often important as a means of diagnosis and in etherization. Lastly, there is the innermost sensitive coat or retina, which has 8 layers, the outer one containing some pigment cells, and the next the rods and cones in which the power of perception is supposed to lie. Branches of the optic nerve being distributed over it in all directions. In fact, the retina is formed by a membranous expansion of the optic or second cranial nerve, the special nerve of sight, which passes into the orbit through the optic foramen at the back and enters the eyeball close to the macula lutea or yellow spot. The exact spot where the optic nerve enters the retina is not sensitive and is known as the blind spot. In the center of the macula lutea, however, which is in the middle of the retina posteriorly, is a tiny pit, the fovea centralis, in which all the layers of the retina except the rods and cones are absent, and at this point vision is most perfect. It is, therefore, always turned toward the object looked at, and when one wishes to see an object distinctly, he must keep moving his eyes over it, that the rays from each part may fall in turn upon the fovea centralis. Directly behind the pupil is the crystalline lenses, a rather firm gelatinous body enclosed in a capsule, which is transparent in life but opaque in death. The lens is doubly convex and is held in place by the suspensory ligaments which arise from the ciliary processes, In front of it is the anterior chamber of the eye, filled with a thin, watery fluid called the aqueous humor, while the larger space back of it, occupying about 4/5 of the entire globe, is filled with a jelly-like substance known as the vitreous humor. The chief artery of the eye is the ophthalmic, ophthalmic, OPHTHALMIC. The chief artery of the eye is the ophthalmic. Light rays. The eye is practically a camera, and its principal function is to reflect images. Although there are several refracting surfaces and media, for practical purposes the cornea alone need be considered. Except for those rays which enter the eye perpendicularly to the cornea, whose line of entrance is called the optic axis, all rays are refracted when they enter the eye, and the point at which they meet and cross each other behind the cornea is called the principal focus of the eye. To focus properly, all the rays from one point on an object must meet again in a common point upon the retina, their conjugate focus. In the normal eye, all the rays from an object are focused on the retina and form upon it an image of the object which, as in the camera, is inverted because of the crossing of the rays behind the cornea. Once focused on the retina, the light traverses the various layers to the layer of rods and cones, where chemical action takes place and affects the little filaments of the optic nerve by which the message is carried to the brain. When the eye is at rest, the pupil and lenses are in their normal condition, and at such times the eye sees only distant objects. The ability of the eye to focus upon objects at different distances is called accommodation. And to accomplish it, three things are necessary. Number one, change in the shape of the lenses. Number two, convergence of the axes of the eyes. And number three, narrowing of the pupils. When the eye is directed toward distant objects, the muscle fibers in the ciliary processes relax, causing tightening of the suspensory ligaments and consequent flattening of the surface of the lenses. Otherwise, an image would be formed in front of the retina, for the greater the convexity of the lens, the greater the angle of refraction. Such accommodation is passive and so not fatiguing. To look at nearby objects, on the contrary, the ciliary muscle contract. To look at nearby objects, on the contrary, the ciliary muscles contract, drawing the choroid forward and allowing the suspensory ligament to relax, so that the lenses bulges in front. This is an exertion. In order to accommodate properly, moreover, both eyes must work together and the axis of both eyes must be directed toward the object. Therefore, in looking at nearby objects, the axis of the eyes converge, or I should say, therefore, in looking at nearby objects, the axes of the eyes converge, drawn by the internal recti muscles. In strabismus, or cross eye, where the axes of both eyes cannot be directed toward the object at the same time, the rays fall upon one part of one eye and upon a different part of the other eye, and two separate images are seen. Finally, there is concentric narrowing of the pupil by contraction of the circular fibers of the iris, by which means various side rays that would come to a focus outside the retina are excluded. All the muscles of accommodation, the ciliary muscles, the internal recti, and the sphincter pupillae, are under the control of the third nerve. Connected with this power of accommodation and dependent on it are the two conditions of nearsightedness and myopia, and farsightedness are hypermetropia. The normal eye is emmetropic and is almost perfectly spherical. But in the nearsighted or myopic eye, the ball, instead of being round, is flattened from above down and so bulges in front. Consequently, owing to the greater distance from the lenses to the retina, images are formed in front of the retina. Only nearby objects can be seen clearly, because the farther the object from the eye, the farther in front of the retina the image is formed. Concave glasses are worn to enable sighted people to see at a distance. Hypermetropic or far-sighted eyes are flattened from before backward and can see only objects at a distance clearly, as those nearby form images behind the retina. For such eyes, convex glasses are worn. As the ordinary person approaches middle life, he becomes able to see better at a distance than near to. This presbyopia, as it is called, which is practically farsightedness, is due to a partial loss of power of accommodation in the lenses, the result of a general loss of elasticity in the parts. As the ordinary person approaches middle life, he becomes able to see better at a distance than near to. This presbyopia, as it is called, which is practically farsightedness, is due to a partial loss of the power of accommodation in the lenses, the result of a general loss of elasticity in the parts. Another very common defect is astigmatism, a failure of the rays to focus upon a point, owing generally to a flattening in the surface of the cornea. Color perception is also an important function of the eye. The waves of hyperluminous ether, when of a certain rate of vibration, give the sensation of heat, and when their vibrations are more rapid, they give the sensation of sight. Each of the primary colors of the spectrum give off a pretty definite number of light rays which travel through the air and enter the eye, the number of rays determining the color thrown upon the retina, and the velocity determining the intensity of the color. Occasionally, when light is passing through the eye, it is broken up as in a prism, and the person gets a sensation of all sorts of colors. Chromatic aberration. Total or partial absence of sensitiveness to color is called color blindness. It is commonest in the form of inability to distinguish between red and green, and is probably due to a defect in the retina. Sometimes a hair follicle on the lid becomes infected and a sty is formed. Pink eye is conjunctivitis or conjunctivitis. Sometimes a hair follicle on the lid becomes infected and a sty is formed. Pink eye is conjunctivitis or inflammation of the conjunctiva. A meibomian duct may become stopped and cause bulging, or there may be a sagging down or ptosis of the upper lid in certain diseases as meningitis, apoplexy, and more especially syphilis. Rodent ulcer often begins by the eye or on the cheek. Structures and functions of the body. Chapter 5, the nervous system. The cerebrum, the cerebellum, pons, veruoli, medulla oblongata, spinal cord, brain centers, motor tract, sensory tract, reflex action, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, Brachio Plexus, Sacral Plexus, the sympathetic system, the sympathetic nerves. Chapter 5, the nervous system. The nervous system, which regulates all the vital processes of the body, physical and chemical, and which is situated partly in the head and partly in the trunk, may well form the connecting link between the description of the head and that of the trunk. It has two divisions, the cerebro-spinal system and the sympathetic system. The former consists of the cerebrum, or brain proper, the cerebellum, or little brain, the pons veruoli, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, and the cranial and spinal nerves, the latter of a series of ganglia or aggregations of nerve centers. The brain, which includes the cerebrum, cerebellum, pons, and medulla, occupies the cranium, and the spinal cord is contained within the bony framework of the spinal column. In the male, the brain weighs about 49 ounces, and in the female, 44, while in an idiot, it seldom weighs more than 23 ounces. The cerebrum, or brain proper, has two parts or hemispheres, roughly oval in shape, each of which has 5 lobes separated by fissures, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal sphenoidal lobes, and the central lobe, or island of Riel, or Real, or Reel. Once again, the cerebrum or brain proper has two parts or hemispheres, roughly oval in shape, each of which has 5 lobes separated by fissures, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal sphenoidal lobes, and the central lobe or island of Riel at the base of the brain. The chief fissures are the longitudinal fissures, the fissure of Sylvius at the base of the brain, and the fissure of Rolando between the frontal and parietal lobes. There are also 5 serious cavities called ventricles, the 2 lateral, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th ventricles, of which the first 2, one is in either hemisphere, are the most important. Around these cavities is the brain substance, which is made up of two tissues. Around these cavities is the brain substance, which is made up of 2 tissues, the white and the gray, the latter forming the outer part of the brain to the depths of perhaps half an inch, and the white matter forming the rest. The outer or gray part is called the cortex and is largely made up of nerve cells. It might be called the active part of the brain. The white part consists largely of nerve fibers which are given off from the nerve cells and are carried down into the spinal cord. The brain, or the surface of the brain, is convoluted. The ridges being separated by deep furrows are sulci, by which means a great extent of gray matter is secured. The furrows contain fluid from the subarachnoid spaces and vary in number and depth according to intelligence. While the convolutions are not uniform in all brains, the principal ones are constant. Both the brain and the spinal cord are covered by 3 membranes, the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The dura mater is dense and fibrous and lines the interior of the skull, being firmly adherent to it at many points. In fact, it constitutes the internal periosteum of the cranial bones. The arachnoid is a delicate serous member. The arachnoid, Hell Queen spider, is a delicate serous membrane with 2 layers, lubricated to prevent friction, which divides the space between the dura mater and the pia mater, bridging over the convolutions and enclosing the subdural and subarachnoid spaces, which are connected with lymphatics and contain a serous secretion, the cerebral spinal fluid. This fluid forms an elastic water cushion on which the brain rests, Arahman alastoa, and prevents concussion. The pia mater is vascular, containing blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves, and is closely attached to the surface of the brain, dipping down into all sulci or sulci. At the base or under surface of the brain are some very important structures. The olfactory bulbs lie beneath the frontal lobe, and projecting back is the olfactory tract, through which the olfactory nerves come from the brain. Back of the olfactory tract is the optic commissure, where the optic nerves coming from the brain cross each other, and back of the commissure again is the optic tract, where the optic nerves emerge from the brain. At the base of the brain are also the exits of the 12 cranial nerves. Upon entering the brain, the arteries run a tortuous course. The tortuosity breaking the force of the bloodstream in the small vessels where congestion would be with difficulty relieved. The bacillar bacillon artery, which is formed by the juncture of the two vertebrals, divides into two posterior cerebrals, each of which joins one of the anterior cerebrals by a posterior communicating artery. The two anterior cerebrals also are joined by an anterior communicating artery, thus completing the circle. The circle thus formed at the base of the brain is called the circle of Willis and provides for a good supply of blood in event of an accident to any vessel. The blood is returned to the general circulation through the cerebral veins and sinuses formed by the separation of the dura mater into two layers. The cerebellum is about 1/7 the size of the cerebrum and weighs about 5 ounces. It lies in the lower occipital fossa of the brain and is oblong in shape and divided into two lateral hemispheres by a transverse fissure. It is made up of both white and gray matter, of which the former predominates, the gray being external as in the cerebrum. The cells are about the same as in the cortex and is the cells are about the same as in the cortex and its surface is traversed by queer furrows. Of its function, little is known, but it probably plays a most important part in the coordination of the nervous and muscular acts by which the movements of the body are carried on. At the back of the cerebrum and below the cerebellum is the pons viroli, which forms a connecting link with the medulla oblongata, or bulging part of the cord. It is made up essentially of white matter, or nerve fibers, though there is a small amount of gray matter in which are found the nuclei of some of the cranial nerves. In the medulla oblongata, which is about 1 inch long and extends from the pons viroli to the upper border of the atlas, or first cervical vertebra, the gray matter is not necessarily external to the white, but is found in patches in the white. The gray matter here corresponds more or less to that of the spinal cord, and the white matter is continuous with that of the cord. From the medulla arise the 5th to 12th cranial nerves and the vasomotor nerves. The cardiac nerve has its center here, and here too are the centers of respiration, phonation, deglutition, mastication, and expression. The cardiac nerve has its center here, and here too are the centers of respiration, phonation, deglutition, mastication, and expression. In the medulla, the nerves that arise in the cerebrum cross over from one side of the body to the other on the crossed pyramidal tracts. The importance of this crossing of the nerve fibers is seen in apoplexy, when a blood vessel is ruptured in the brain and hemorrhage causes pressure, generally on the motor tract. Paralysis of the nerves and of the muscles to which they go results. The paralysis is generally on one side of the body. The paralysis is generally on one side of the body, the opposite side from that on which the injury occurred. The seat of injury in the brain or cord can frequently be determined by the situation and extent of the paralysis. Spinal cord, extending down from the medulla through the spinal column is the cord. Its length from the foramen magnum, where it begins, down through the vertebrae to the lower border of the first lumbar vertebra, where it ends in a very fine thread-like process with no special function, called the filum terminale, is 17 to 18 inches. Just before it ends, a number of nerves are given off in a tail-like expansion known as the quadra equina or horse's tail. It is not uniform throughout its length, but presents two enlargements, a cervical enlargement in the lower cervical region and a lumbar enlargement in the lower dorsal region, where the nerves are given off to the arms and legs respectively. The membranes are the same as those of the brain and are continuous with them, but here the dura mater is not attached to the bony walls enclosing it, for the cord does not fit closely into the cranial, for the cord does not fit closely into the canal, but is as it were suspended in it. The subarachnoid space communicates with the ventricles of the brain by the foramen of Magendie and is filled with cerebral spinal fluid for the protection of the cord. In cerebral spinal meningitis, or spotted fever, this fluid is infected, and for diagnosis, lumbar puncture is performed. The recording is being made on Meta Facebook Stories by Luxottica Ray-Ban. Wayfarers type. To continue, if a cross-section of the cord is made, it is found to have a pretty definite structure. It is roughly circular and is divided by certain fissures, of which the most important are the anterior and posterior median, the latter being rather a dividing line or septum. By them it is divided into halves, connected by a small band in the middle called commissure. The white matter is exterior to the gray and is divided by it into four columns, which again are divided into tracts according to certain groups of nerves that travel through them. The most important tract is the direct pyramidal tract in the anterior column. The gray matter is arranged in the form of a letter H, practically consisting of two lateral halves, more or less crescentic in outline, connected by a narrow band. The gray commissure, each half is divided into two horns, the anterior toward the front of the cord and the posterior toward the back, the former being generally much thicker and heavier than the latter. The structure of the gray and of the white matter is essentially the same as in the brain, but the proportion varies in different parts of the cord, the white predominating in the cervical region and the gray being much better developed in the lumbar region, where the nerve cells for control of the lower extremities occur. The gray is least well developed in the dorsal region. Through the center of the cord runs a small hole or canal filled with cerebrospinal fluid, the central canal of the cord. The brain is the seat of intelligence and will, the center of all voluntary action. Molecular change in some part of the cerebral substance is the indispensable accompaniment of every phenomenon of consciousness. Indeed, the brain is never in a state of complete repose, there being dreams even during sleep. The brain is not sensitive to injury in the sense of pain. It can be lacerated without much pain. Various centers exist in the brain, of which the most important perhaps is the motor center. The visual center is in the occipital lobe, the auditory center in the temporal lobe, the speech center in the third left frontal convolution. Thus, the impulses of the senses have been located, though the function of many parts, the so-called silent areas, are still in obscurity. The motor center, that is, the center for motion of the skeletal muscles, is situated about the fissure of Rolando and is divided into three parts, one for the legs, one for the face, and one for the arms. The one for the legs being uppermost and the other below in the order mentioned. Fibers from these cells extend down through the brain and cord to the muscles, the fibers being collected into well recognized bundles, and the whole known as the motor tract. There may be one long fiber from a cell in the brain down through most of the cord, or there may be a succession of shorter fibers which are not actually connected, but are in close contact with each other. In the upper bones, the fibers for the face cross to the opposite side, while the rest keep on down through the medulla, and as they emerge from the medulla, they too cross to the other side and keep on down in the cross pyramidal tract. A few fibers do not cross but come down the direct pyramidal tract, which, however, disappears partway down. The crossed pyramidal tract is the two motor tract, and in it the fibers are continually sending branches to the cells in the gray matter, where they connect with the anterior horn. The anatomy of the sensory tract is not so well understood. By it, impulses are sent to the brain by the peripheral organs, practically the surface of the body. The sensory fibers connect with the sensory cells in the posterior horn, from which fibers are sent to the brain, practically the reverse of motor action. There are three chief sensory tracts which are supposed to transmit different sensations. One pain, one muscular sensations, and the third sensations of touch. All these tracts, of which the chief is the direct cerebellar tract, in passing up the cord pass to the opposite side at different levels and then go on to the cortex of the brain. The action of the nerves is similar to reflex action, only that an effort of will is needed to send an impulse from the brain. It is by the help of the brain along this line that an infinity of artificial reflexes or habits is acquired, for which volition is needed in the beginning, but which are later done unconsciously. Herein lie the possibilities of all education. The action of the nerves is similar to reflex action, only that an effort of will is needed to send an impulse from the brain. It is by the help of the brain along this line that an infinity of artificial reflexes or habits is acquired, for which volition is needed in the beginning, but which are later done unconsciously. Herein lie the possibilities of all education. The brain and spinal cord work together, the cord acting as a medium between the brain, in which all the higher psychical processes, such as will, thought, etc., originate, and the muscular apparatus. The cord, however, has some action entirely independent of the brain, as is seen in reflex action. This action is entirely involuntary, so that the cord is sometimes spoken of as the seat of involuntary action, commonly called reflex action. All unconscious acts are All unconscious acts are reflex acts, as when the hand is drawn away from a hot iron. If an impulse is sent along one of the sensory fibers, it enters the cord through the posterior horn, where its nerve cell is found. Then, through some connection between the nerve cell of the sensory fiber and that of the motor fiber, the impulse is transmitted to the motor cell, and another impulse is sent out of the cord along the motor fiber of the nerve to the muscle. One of the commonest reflexes is the knee jerk. Reflex action is important because the reflexes are interfered with, delayed, destroyed, or increased in different diseases. The time normally required for a reflex act is very brief, but for the knee jerk being that for the time normally required for a reflex action is very brief. That for the knee jerk being about 3/100ths of a second. The nerves of the head, known as the cranial nerves, arise from the brain, while the rest of the body is supplied by the spinal nerves, which come off at intervals from the spinal cord. The cranial nerves consist of 12 parts. 1. The olfactory or nerve of smell. 2. The optic or nerve of sight. 3. The motor oculi. 4. The pathicus, which controls the eye. 5. The trigeminus or trifacial, a nerve of general sensation, motion, and taste. 6. The abducens, a motor nerve. 7. The facial nerve of the face, ear, palate, and tongue. 8. The auditory or nerve of hearing. 9. The glossopharyngeal nerve of sensation and taste. 10. The pneumogastric or vagus, which is both motor and sensory and governs respiration, the heart, and the stomach. 11. The spinal accessory to the muscles of the soft palate. And 12. The hypoglossal, the motor nerve to the tongue. The spinal nerves also are arranged in pairs. 8 cervical pairs, 12 dorsal or thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, these titles denoting their point of origin near the vertebra of the same name. Each of these nerves arises by 2 roots, an anterior motor root from the anterior horn of gray matter, and a posterior sensory root from the posterior horn, the latter having a ganglion upon it. After emerging from the cord, the two roots unite to form the nerve, that the nerve may contain both motor and sensory fibers. The motor fibers are called efferent because they carry impulses from the cord, while the sensory are called afferent because they carry impulses back to the cord. After leaving the cord, the nerves unite to form plexuses, which again divide into various nerve trunks and are distributed to the muscles. The first cervical nerves pass out of the spinal column above the first cervical vertebra, and the other cervical nerves below that and the succeeding vertebrae, while the other spinal nerves emerge each below the corresponding vertebra, as the first dorsal below the first dorsal vertebra, etc. After emerging, they break up into a large anterior division and a small posterior division, the posterior branches supplying the spine and the dorsal muscle and skin, the anterior the rest of the trunk and the limbs. The cervical plexus is formed by the anterior divisions of the first four cervical nerves, the Brachio Plexus by the last four cervical and the first dorsal or thoracic nerves, the lumbar plexus by the four upper lumbar and the sacral plexus by the last lumbar and the four upper sacral nerves. The only important branch of any of the four upper cervical nerves, which is generally the only important branch of any of the four upper cervical nerves, which in general supply the neck and shoulders, is the phrenic, which is distributed to the pericardium, the pleura, and the undersurface of the diaphragm. The brachial plexus, as its name implies, supplies the arms and has a number of important branches, as the circumflex to the shoulder, the musculocutaneous to the upper arm, the elbow joint, and the outer surface of the forearm, the internal cutaneous to the inner side of the arm, the median to the pronators and flexors, and the fingers on the radial side, and the ulnar to the elbow and wrist joint. The musculospiral runs down the spiral groove to the external condyle or condyle of the humerus or upper arm bone, where it divides into the radial and the posterior inter or intergrossisius, the former going to the thumb and two adjacent fingers, and the latter to the wrist joint and the muscles of the back of the forearm. Sometimes, in fracture of the humerus, the callus thrown out pinches the musculospiral and causes pain. The dorsal or thoracic nerves supply the back with their posterior divisions, and their anterior divisions are the intercostal nerves. The lumbar nerves supply the abdomen, pelvis, and thigh, the chief branches being the iliohypogastric to the abdomen and gluteal region, the ilioinguinal to the inguinal region and scrotum, the external cutaneous and genitocrural to the thigh, and the obturator to the thigh and the hip and knee joints. The anterior crural descends beneath Baupart's ligament and divides into an anterior and a posterior division which supply the thigh muscles, its branches going to the pelvis. The Sacral Plexus supplies the organs of the pelvis, the thigh, and the leg. Its chief branches are the great sciatic, the largest nerve in the body, and the small sciatic, which go to the buttocks and thigh. The great sciatic runs down the back of the thigh and divides at the lower third of the thigh into the internal and external popliteal nerves, the former of which passes along the back of the thigh to the knee, where it becomes the posterior tibial, which in turn divides at the ankle into the internal and external plantar. The external popliteal descends along the outer side of the popliteal space and divides an inch below the head of the fibula into the anterior tibial, which supplies the flexors and skin of the ankle joint, and the musculocutaneous, which sends branches to the skin of the lower leg and the dorsum of the foot. The sympathetic system, joined to the cerebrospinal system by intervening cords, is the sympathetic system. This is made up of two series of ganglia on either side of the spinal column, connected by longitudinal bands and extending from the base of the skull to the coccyx. They do not form an independent nervous system. Each ganglion, which seems to resemble the motor cells of the spinal cord, being connected by motor and sensory fibers with the cerebral system. The sympathetic system, joined to the cerebrospinal system by intervening cords, is the sympathetic system. This is made up of two series of ganglia on one either side. This is made up of two series of ganglia, one on either side of the spinal column, connected by longitudinal bands and extending from the base of the skull to the coccyx. They do not form an independent nervous system. Each ganglion, which seems to resemble the motor cells of the spinal cord, being connected by motor and sensory fibers with the cerebral system. The sympathetic nerves are mostly gray, non-medulated fibers, and are distributed to viscera, secreting glands, and blood vessels, whose movements are involuntary and feelings obtuse. They form networks upon the heart and other viscera and send branches to the cranium, to the organs of special sense. There are three main plexuses. There are three main plexuses: the solar plexus behind the stomach, which supplies the abdominal viscera, the hypogastric plexus in front of the prominence of the sacrum, whose nerves go to the pelvic organs, and the cardiac plexus behind the aortic arch for the thoracic viscera. Over these nerves one has no control. A blow in the region between the costal cartilages and below the sternum is a solar plexus blow and is very upsetting. The sympathetic system serves to maintain vitality in all the important portions of the system, and one of its important functions is to keep up communication between one part and another so that when any organ is affected, the others will act accordingly and help out to the best of their ability.